that presents America's forgotten history and heroes with an emphasis on moral, religious, and constitutional heritage. David is the author of numerous best-selling books, with the subjects being drawn largely from his massive library museum of tens of thousands of original writings and documents, artifacts from our early America. He also addresses well over 400 groups each year. His exhaustive research has rendered him an expert in historical and constitutional issues. He serves as a consultant to state and federal legislators. He's participated in several cases at the Supreme Court level. He's also been involved in development of social study standards for numerous states, and has helped produce some popular history textbooks now used in schools across our nation. National news organizations describe him as, quote, America's historian. The Time magazine called him a hero to millions. And I would ditto that, including some powerful politicians. Time magazine also named him as one of America's 25th most influential evangelists. David has received numerous national and international awards, including Who's Who in Education, DAR's Medal of Honor, the George Washington Honor Medal from the Freedoms Foundation of Valley Forge. His work in media has merited several Angel Awards, Telly Awards, and Dove Foundation Seal of Approval. David and his wife Cheryl reside in Texas, and they have 3 grown children, Timothy, Stephen, and Damaris. I want to introduce now David Barton.
It's good to be with you. It's good to be at a Common Core conference. It's, you know, political folks will figure out that this thing is gaining momentum across the nation. The grassroots is bubbling up really big. They haven't quite gotten it up here yet, but they will. And so it's moving in the right direction. I love what's happening at the Common Core. It is a national movement of folks who are against it, but nobody's organized the national movement. It's just all local people find out what's going on. They don't like it. They want good stuff for their kids. And so it mystifies the media because they can't figure out who's behind this. And it's kind of like whack-a-mole, you know. You can't figure out which one. And it's great because there's no national, it's a national movement but with no head. And that really is healthy. What I want to do in addressing the issues of Common Core and in dealing with Common Core is, let's see, there it is. In dealing with Common Core, I can give you a lot of specifics. We could be here literally hours with details. I want to just give you some 30,000-foot overview kind of things and some perspectives. So when you look at the problems with Common Core, let me just take you through 8. It standardizes mediocrity and it lacks academic rigor. A lot of ways to prove that. There's a lot of websites out there that have great studies on that. The states that have already started testing using Common Core standards have been exceptionally disappointed in how poorly their students are doing. So it is purported as being rigorous, and it is anything but. The second thing I'd point out, it undermines local and state controls for accountability, abrogates federalism as well as parental rights. I was just last Thursday with a number of chairmen in the U.S. House of Representatives. One was John Klein, the chairman of the Education Committee in the House. And I don't think you've probably heard this on news, but the House has already voted to completely wipe out Common Core. They can't. There's that other body on the other side of the Capitol. The House has passed 200 measures they can't even get a hearing on in the Senate side. So Common Core is one of those that can wipe it. John, great representative, head of the Education Committee, was telling me, he said, you know, and if you don't know the background of this, the background of Common Core is that it was not national. It was all the state governors got together and said, we don't want the feds involved in education. We'll come up with our own standards at the state level and the feds will be out of it. So it was started as a state initiative. Before long, it became a state-led national initiative. And now, and so if you say, well, it's a federal program, the Common Core will say, no, it's not a federal program. It's a national program. Well, John was telling me that the hearings that they've been having on Common Core, now the people in Washington, D.C., the experts on this out of the Department of Education, are not only saying that it is federal standards, they're calling it a federal curriculum. So we now have them agreeing that, yeah, it is a federal curriculum. So that violates all the precepts of federalism, the 10th Amendment, everything else that goes with it. So there's a lot of problems with that. Parental rights as well. We've had hearings in states like Michigan where they say, you know, if parents object to what's being taught in the classroom, they can't go to the local state board of education, even the state board of education. They're going to have to go all the way to the federal Department of Education if they have something that they object to. Well, where do parental rights go with that? We're having enough parental rights problems as it is without taking it further away from parents. Third thing I'd point to is that implementation will be costly for states and for schools. And by the way, let me go back to the second one for a minute, because I'm a big fan in trying to be exactly fair and truthful. If we lose the debate on the basis of truth, that's fine, but I don't want to lose it on the basis of lies. I was at a meeting yesterday with about 650 pastors where Mike Huckabee got up for the third time that I've heard him in the last year and said he's absolutely opposed to Common Core. Now, that's not out there at all, because what happened is he was a big proponent of Common Core back when he was one of the governors who helped get this thing going. He was a big proponent of getting the federal government out of education. And so he has been promoting Common Core as getting the feds out. And now that the feds have taken it over and they're subsidizing it with the decreasing funds for racial top, he's absolutely opposed to it. So people are still promoting what Mike said some time back as opposed to where he is now. But again, 650 pastors yesterday, question came up on Common Core, he is absolutely opposed to it. So I don't mind if we keep saying who's for and who's against, but just take Mike off the list of who's for, because he was for it when it was a state thing. He's not for it now that's become transmuted into a federal thing. Third thing to say here, implementation will be costly for states and schools. A lot of states have figured out that they're wanting us to use Apple computers and other things. Every kid gets one. We can't even buy crayons for the kids now, so we're going to come up with money to get computers for every one of these kids. Then you also have a problem that introduces new and untested educational methods and methodology. There's great examples. Common Core conference just recently, and one of the things pointed out is, for example, what we do in trigonometry with the math standards was actually introduced by the Russians about 30 years ago, and they dropped it because it was a dismal failure. It didn't work for any of their kids. That's all right. America, we can make it work. We keep saying the stuff is internationally normed. Well, it is. The stuff that didn't work in any other nation. So. Number 5 is data mining is particularly intrusive, dangerous to constitutional rights. People keep denying there's data mining there. In Georgia this last week, in the legislature, they had a Common Core bill, and one of the things was to prohibit data mining. Interestingly, Google Analytics and all sorts of national attorneys came to Georgia to testify that no, don't change Common Core because we need the data that's being mined out of it. Wait a minute, you've been denying that there was data mining going on, so why did you send all these guys down here to defend the data mining, saying that you need data mining? So, again, Common Core advocates say, oh no, there's not data mining in it. Yeah, there is. All you have to do is listen to the testimony that's going when you try to take data mining out of the Common Core aspect. The 6th thing that I'd point to is it includes open over philosophical indoctrination in numerous specific areas. The first guy to say no to Common Core was our Texas Superintendent of Public Instruction, Robert Scott. He is a guy who early on read every single page out of the Common Core standards. He points out that in math standards, for example, they have you do math problems where you solve problems related to global warming, but you don't have the alternative side of that. Now, we haven't had global warming in 17 years, and when you only show one side, that is indoctrination. One of the things that we deal with in creating social studies standards, I'm a big fan if you teach the good, you teach the bad, and you teach the ugly. You don't selectively edit what you want because you like it or don't like it. And so as we were going through in one state recently, we're talking about McCarthyism and all the stuff with McCarthy and all the stuff that happened in that era. And I said, great, let's nail McCarthy, but let's also point out the Republican Party censored him for the way he treated witnesses, and make sure that we get that side as well. And while we're at it, do not forget to mention the Venona Papers. And they said, the what? I said, the Venona Papers. What's that? Well, after the wall fell, the Soviet Union fell apart, they released a lot of their intelligence, and their intelligence identified a number of spies that were working in the American government at the time. McCarthy was on the right track, he just went about it the wrong way. But let's not say that McCarthyism is totally wrong because there was nothing subversive going on in government, because there was, because the Russians now confirm it. Oh, we don't want to include that in the standards. Why not? You teach the good, the bad, the ugly. So what we try to do is, in creating good standards, is you have no tone to the standards. You put the stuff out there. in social studies particularly, you don't take tone. In political science, you can take all the tone you want to and talk about what's good, bad, whatever. So in doing that, that's not what Common Core has done. They will give you single examples with nothing to balance the other side, as global warming. There's nothing to say, let's calculate the areas where global warming is not occurring. There's nothing like that. So it does include indoctrination by the selective use of the examples that it has the students do. Even in math standards, you're getting indoctrination into science areas as well. You also have supplementary materials, recommended materials, dark, depressing, offensive content. With Glenn Beck, we did a television program on this at one point. One of the literature works that they have recommended, it involves, for 11th graders, involves exceptionally graphic and explicit sexual relations and sexual activity that include incest and rape within a family. And, we looked at that and said, that's not appropriate for 11th graders. And in talking to the author of the book, you had rape and incest in here, but never once did you say it was wrong. And the reply was, well, in case a student was involved in rape or incest, I didn't want to feel bad about it. Just go through the supplemental reading materials. There was another one that we went through recently that dealt with, and actually dealt with the Bill of Rights. And it gave you the Bill of Rights, except it didn't give you the original wording, and it didn't tell you that it altered the wording. And so on the First Amendment, it says there's a guaranteed separation of church and state, which is nowhere in the First Amendment. On the Second Amendment, it says it gives the right to the military to own guns. That's not the Second Amendment. Kids didn't know that that wasn't the original Bill of Rights, that had been summarized for them by the editors with the editor's view rather than reading original documents. So the supplemental materials, the recommended materials tend to be very bad. And then 8, that reshapes all education, including private Christian homeschools by means of testing criterion. Let's say you totally, absolutely object to what's going on with the Common Core. David Coleman, who runs the SAT test, has announced that they're changing the SAT test to match up with Common Core standards. But you object to that, so you won't have all the indoctrination that all the other kids will get. So when you come to test, you won't get the same high scores that everybody gets because you don't believe and you didn't get exposed to all the propaganda they had, which means if you intended to go to a particular school over here, you may find your scores about 40, 50 points too low to be able to attend that school. And so since Christian schools and parochial schools and homeschools and others want their kids to be able to go to the school of their choice, they're going to have to teach all the Common Core stuff, otherwise they can't pass the college entrance exams and get the high enough score to get where they want to go. So it really will directly affect every form of education, even alternative education that objects to what they taught in Common Core. There is not an alternative test at SAT, ACT at this point. The only way this is really going to get busted up is if we get an alternative test that's credible with the universities that test like we used to test on academic knowledge rather than academic philosophy. Where we are now is academic philosophy. So there's a lot that can be spent on each of those. I just go through them real briefly. What I'd like to do, if I could, is just show you a little bit about what happens with Common Core. I'm going to show you a clip. It's about 10 minutes. It's of a program that I did with Glenn Beck where we put a lot of this together. And it just kind of gives you a little overview of a lot of problem areas. We can talk about them later, but let me go into those areas and show you those right now.
This old stuff represents true academic rigor. Education today is moving further.
With Common Core, let me just say, bottom line is, to use an accent from the South, we've had problems with education for a good while. That's why they think Common Core will fix that. But it is the traditional lipstick on the pig. It is not going to fix problems because the problems are more fundamental than what they're playing with. The other Texas axiom we use is you got a dog chasing its tail. I mean, it's going to go nowhere. So Common Core will not improve scores. It will not do any of the things that they suggest. It will give them a lot more control, a lot more insight, a lot more material, etc. And where I want to spend the remainder of my time is going back to that 30,000-foot level. There is a great quote from founding father George Mason. George Mason was one of the 55 guys who wrote the Constitution of the United States. After the Constitutional Convention was over, he is the one who went to the other states and said, we need a Bill of Rights. And that's why he is called the father of the Bill of Rights. He is also the chief author of the Virginia Constitution of 1776. The Virginia Constitution of 1776, actually, Virginia separated from Great Britain before the Declaration of Independence was even done. They did it the month before. They said, we're done with Great Britain, we're independent, and here's our new Constitution. Well, he is a chief chief author of that Constitution that separated a lot of what was in that Constitution was subsequently used in the Declaration of Independence, same language, etc. And he has a quote that is so profound that they placed it in the beginning of the Virginia Constitution. And in that Virginia Constitution, they have kept that quote alive through subsequent constitutions. Look what he said. He says, "No free government, nor the blessings of liberty, can be preserved in any people but by a frequent recurrence to fundamental principles." He said the only way you keep liberty alive is you have to keep going back to fundamental principles and remember first things first. And that's what we've not done in education, but that's what I want to do for a bit. I want to go back to the fundamental purposes, the fundamental principles of education. When you look at America, where we are today, regardless of what political affiliation you might have, regardless of what problems you think we have, we're hands down blessed in a way that no other nation's ever been. It's easy stuff. There's 195 nations at the UN this year, and that number goes up and down every year. It depends on literally who had a war, who had a revolution, if Crimea just voted to secede, or I mean, the numbers are different every single year. And yet, when you look at America over that last 237 years, you go back to 1789 when we did our Constitution. Choose any other nation, any other continent. France had 15 constitutions, same time we've had one. Just go through every other nation, every other continent, and look how often there is instability. Look how often there's revolution. Look how often they have to trash their government and start with something totally new. I mean, you go through all this stuff. I mean, you take even South Korea. South Korea is our friend. They've had 6 constitutions since 1848. Very prosperous, very healthy nation. 6 constitutions. If you're 90 years old and you're alive in Poland today, you've lived through 7 constitutions and 7 revolutions. I mean, we don't think like that. We haven't thought of a revolution, a constitution, new constitution since our first one. I mean, it's just, we don't understand that mentality. So we have stability like no other nation. We also have creativity like no other nation. Unlike other nations of the world, we are not all that populous. We're only 4% of the world's population given our land mass. But yet that 4% every year, we produce more inventions, more medical discoveries, more cures. We produce more of everything than the other 96% of the world combined. Now, 4% of the world's population should produce 4% of the world's results. No. Our 4% produces more than the other 96%. And even if you look at where we are with economics and prosperity, our 4% of the world's population produces more. Well, I guess the best way to say it, our 4% of the world's population produces 25% of the world's gross domestic product. Now, we do not produce more because we have more. That is not accurate. And I'm a cowboy, I'm a rancher, have a horse and cattle and all the stuff that goes with it. And farmers represent only 1% of America's population. Yet our 1% of our population produces enough food to feed the entire world. And America only has in percentage of farmable land, we are only 66th in the world. We don't produce more because we got more land that produces. That's not true. We're 66th in the world in percentage of farmable land. And yet our 1% that uses that farmable land produces enough to feed the entire world. See, we're very, very prosperous in a way that we don't recognize. As a matter of fact, the Census Bureau that does the enumeration of people every 10 years, according to the Census Bureau, if you happen to live below the poverty level in America, and we don't want anyone living below poverty level in America, but if you do, if you live below poverty level in America, according to figures from the Census Bureau, you're more likely to own a telephone, a television, an air conditioner, an automobile. You're more likely to eat more red meat, and you're more likely to have more square footage of living space than the average middle class in Europe. Did you get that? If you're in poverty in America, your lifestyle is higher than the second richest place on the face of the globe, Western Europe. You have a higher lifestyle in poverty in America. Now see, the World Bank is what sets a standard for international poverty. The standard for international poverty this year is if you make $1.25 a day, you're in poverty. Now that's $456 a year. If you're a developing nation that's doing fairly well, they raise the standard to $2 a day. That is the poverty standard. If you make $2 a day or less, you're in poverty. That means $730 a year. So that's the world standard for poverty. 1.9 billion people live in poverty. $2 a day or less income, or $1.25 a day less income. You know what poverty standard is in America? $40,000. $40,000 for a family of 4. Our poverty standard is 100 times higher than the world poverty standard, which is why everybody in the world wants to come to America and live in poverty. If they could just be in poverty here, they'd raise their lifestyle.
You realize how blessed we are? Now, we're blessed with this, and you know, this is what we call American exceptionalism. That was a term given us in 1831 by Alexis de Tocqueville. But there's a great statement that Abraham Lincoln made about 100 years afterwards where he said this. He said, the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next. If we came up with a successful philosophy of government by then that produced the most creativity, most productivity, most stability, if we came up with a philosophy of government that we've had for these 237 years that have made us different from every other nation in the world, it came out of the classroom. It came from what we were teaching in the classroom. So the bigger question is, what was the philosophy of education back at that time? Now, we have about 100,000 documents that we have that are from before 1812. So I have thousands of handwritten documents of George Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, all those guys. And we have tons of educational materials. And if you look at the purpose of education, early American education had two objectives. There were two things we tried to do with education. We understood this is what produced sound education. And you can take Common Core or anything else and compare it to these standards, because this is what worked for those 237 years, or if you will, probably about 280 years, or 180 years that it worked. Last 40 to 50 years, we've been in a lot of trouble. But take what worked for all nearly 2 centuries, and you'll find there were two things. Number one objective of education was to teach religion, morality, and knowledge in that order. Number two objective of education was to teach thinking skills. Now let me take you through each of those historically. The first, to teach religion, morality, and knowledge, all I need to do is go back to a federal law that was passed in 1789, signed by George Washington. This law went through the House on the 17th of July, 1789. The Senate passed it August the 4th, 1789, and George Washington signed it in law August 7th, 1789. This is a Northwest Ordinance, and they said, you know, we've got these 13 states out there, but what if you live in the Southern Territory, or the Ohio Territory, or the Northwest Territory? How do you become a state in the United States? And that's where they passed this law that was called the Northwest Ordinance. And so they said, well, if you want to be a state in the United States, and again, Washington signed this in law August the 7th, 1789, if you want to be a state in the United States, here's what you have to do. And so they laid out the provisions whereby all of these states came in. All these states had to come in, and to this day, if you look in the U.S. Code Annotated, which are our federal laws, page 1 lists 4 organic laws that no state or federal law is allowed to violate. One of those 4 laws is Northwest Ordinance. 32 states came in under the provisions of the Northwest Ordinance. It said if you want to be a territory, if you're a territory, you want to be a state in the United States, you have to get 40,000 in your territory. You have to set up a Republican form of government. Here's what you do with your judiciary. Here's what you do with your elected government. Here's what and it also had education. And if you want to be part of the United States of America, here's what you have to be doing with education. Article 3, this is out of the ordinance, it says, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Because we recognize by federal law that religion, morality, and knowledge makes good government and makes people happy. That's what we're going to promote in education, is religion, morality, and knowledge. Now, it is significant that, let me just give you an example on something. Let me take you over to North Carolina for a minute. Here's North Carolina. You heard Randy mention I've been involved in a lot of legal cases, etc. And there was an interesting case that came out of North Carolina where an 8th grade student, junior high student, was in a rural district. And in a rural district, you can get away with a lot more when it comes to faith and other things than you can in city and urban districts, suburban districts. And this kid's in a little rural district. And what he did at his locker during passing periods was he would invite his friends to come to a Fellowship of Christian Athletes meeting. He'd invite them to go to him with his youth group at night. And so he would give out invitations from his locker. Said, hey, here's FCA, here's when it meets, here's our youth group, here's when it meets. And one of the teachers saw him at his locker giving out invitations to his friends. That teacher went and reported to the principal what this kid was doing. And the principal went and got the superintendent of that little district. And all 3 of those adults came back to that 8th grade kid and got around him and said, you will take this material out of your locker, you will take this home, you will not mention this again. This violates the law. That 8th grade kid had the guts and the gumption to reach into his locker and he pulled out a copy of the North Carolina State Constitution. And in the state constitution it said, forever in the schools of this state, religion, morality, and knowledge will be taught as well as. He said, whoa, wait a minute. The teacher said, you're kidding. That's in our constitution? Yeah. But see, we don't teach that anymore. It's amazing how many states have that provision. I mean, Ohio does, and Nebraska does, and all these states still have the provision in their Constitution, because you couldn't be part of the United States if your schools didn't teach religion and morality as well as knowledge. So that was a big educational emphasis, no question about it. So religion, morality, knowledge, that's number one objective of education. You can't even be part of the United States if your schools don't teach that. The second thing was to teach thinking skills. Now, teaching thinking skills, there's a couple of ways we particularly did this, actually several ways, but I'll give you some examples. We had a book that we used for generations called The Improvement of the Mind by Isaac Watts. This went through numerous educational generations. I mean, this was around for the better part of 2 centuries as part of it, because it taught you how to think. One of the ways we applied that is in the use of what is called forensics. You see, you see all these word forensics here? And now, I will admit that I've watched enough crime on TV to think that forensics is what they do with dead bodies after you get done. I had no idea what this was. And so in going back to look at forensics, it turns out that forensics is a Latin word. Forensics comes in 1650, and forensics means the art of public argumentation. The ability to be able to debate something with knowledge from both sides. And so what they did was they placed you in situation forensics. What I'm going to show you is comes from Robert Troop Payne back in the founding days. This is what they did with 13-year-old kids. And by the way, the other thing you need to know is I show you through education. You didn't know until the 1920s we only required 8 grades of education in public schools. 12th grade is 1920. So when I'm showing you all the things I'm going to show you about education, you need to know that that was 8th grade and below. This is what 8th graders did and below. And so this is what we had in education. So here's some of the forensics we had. Here, see this forensic at the bottom? It says, whether the conduct of the patriots who destroyed the tea in Boston Harbor is to be, in 1773, is to be condemned. So what the teacher does, comes into class and says, okay, what we're going to debate today is when they had the Boston Tea Party in 1773, is that an act that should be condemned or an act that should be praised? Okay, you take praise, you take condemned, let's see you go at it right now. And right there, you have to go at it. And you're having to think, I just heard his arguments, what are the weaknesses in his argument? You know, I actually believe what he believes, but I've got to argue against him. So what are the weaknesses in his argument? And you have to be able to find the weaknesses, articulate your thoughts, and attack the weaknesses of the other side. Then you have to figure out what your weaknesses are and come out with your strengths. And so that's, and then you'd flip it and say, all right, now you're for and you're against. Because what you're teaching is how to think, how to identify weaknesses, how to identify strengths, how to articulate, how to publicly argue your position. Look at some of the others. I associate with no one, I employ no one who's not of my party in religion and politics. Okay, you're for, you're against. Let's hear you go after. Now we're doing this with 8th graders and below. Here's another one. Is there less danger in believing too much or too little? Is it more dangerous to know too much? All right, let's debate that. Here's another one. Is there more to be gained or lost by a new translation of the Scripture for common use? We got so many translations of Scripture. Yeah, let's have another one. Is that good or bad? Well, who knows? See, notice that there is not a right or a wrong answer to any of this, because that wasn't the point. The point is teaching you how to think, teaching you how to identify and recognize weaknesses and strengths and create an argument that is based on those weaknesses and strengths. You're evaluating information. Well, that was part of it. One of the other things that was very interesting, and if you go back to the Scriptures, there's a Scripture we're all familiar with probably. Proverbs 22 says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he won't depart from it. And we use that say, you know, if we can just teach them when they're young, well then when they're old, they won't ever forget it. And that's not really what that Scripture says. The original language, it says, catechize a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he won't depart from it. Now, catechize, that is a specific teaching method. Catechisms, you've probably heard them with the religious things, but no, we used to believe that if you catechize a child in the way he should go, then when he was old, he would never forget that knowledge. Which is why we had catechisms on ancient history, which is why we had catechisms on chemistry and geology. We had catechisms on American law. We had catechisms on entomology, the study of insects. We had catechisms on the history of the United States. We had catechisms on astronomy and science. We had catechisms on the Constitution. Everything was, see, but today we say, oh no, kids get so bored having to learn questions and answers. Hey, guess what? It's what worked. It's what caused us to remember knowledge. The Scripture says if you will catechize someone, they will never ever depart from that knowledge they get through catechisms. And that's why Jesus sat with when he was 12 years old with the teachers of the law, and they catechized. They asked questions back and forth. They argued by using questions. They said, well, wait a minute. Well, see, we don't do questions anymore. We've changed things completely. This is all part of teaching how to think. Now, what happened was, this concept of teaching religion, morality, and knowledge, and the concept of teaching thinking skills, we changed that. We decided we didn't want to do that anymore. And so what we did with the change on both of these areas, we said religion, morality, no. Can't do that. And so the Supreme Court, June the 25th, 1963, in the case called Engel versus Vitale, followed the next 2 years, but 2 more cases, Abbott and Shemp, Murray Collette, June the 17th of 63. They said, you know this deal about doing prayer and Bible in school? We don't want religion in schools. Once you take out religion, you lose morality, but that's a different argument. So it was all gone. Within a 12-month period of time, what the court did was the reverse 200 years of public policy. So religion, morality, and knowledge is out the door. Now, thinking, what happened with thinking? We decided we didn't like that anymore. And so what we did was we changed, and by the way, this came a lot through progressive educators back in the early 1920s, 30s, and 40s. These are the guys who said 8 years is not enough for a good indoctrination. You need an additional 4 years to be able to really indoctrinate people. So we went from 8 years of knowledge to 12 years of indoctrination. And the kind of educators, you had Robert Ingersoll as a leader, and Parker, and you had Lester Ward, you had William Herd Kirkpatrick, and of course you had John Dewey. These are all progressive educators who fundamentally changed the way we taught in the philosophy of education. And what they came out with was, you know, we've been teaching students how to think. We really need to teach students how to learn instead of how to think. And so the emphasis went from thinking to learning. Well, what difference does that make? Well, it takes the emphasis from the student to the teacher. Instead of the student being the one to learn, the teacher is the one who teaches. Or excuse me, the student being the one to think, the teacher is the one who teaches. And therefore, you need to learn what the teacher says. Rather than being a self-feeder, we now rely on the small end of the funnel being the teacher, and they will give us the knowledge we need. And all we have to do is recite back to them what we've learned from the teacher, not to think. And that's why if you look in the 1920s with progressive education, they totally changed the way that we do tests. And if you recall, you may not recall, but in that period of time, what we did was we said, well, the best way to teach knowledge, not thinking, the best way to teach knowledge is we will ask fill-in-the-blank questions, and we will ask true-false questions, and we will ask multiple-choice questions. Because that way, the student can tell us back what they learned from the teacher. So we're not thinking anymore, we're now reciting back whatever the teacher tells us. And that's a completely different emphasis in education. So this concept of thinking, out the door. We're now into learning, and when you become only a learner and not a thinker, you become very, very gullible. That's why you're subject to indoctrination, because you don't think through things. You just get, you know, I saw it on the internet, it has to be true. That kind of nonsense. Well, I heard it on the media. Well, I heard 3 media outlets. Think through it. Is it possible that they themselves did not? See, we don't think through things anymore. We're very gullible, which is why right now, 50% of the nation in a presidential election casts its vote on the basis of 30-second TV commercials. That's not thinking. You know what you can do with 30 seconds of Mother Teresa to make her look bad, or 30 seconds of Hitler to make him look good. 30 seconds, these guys can make anybody look like anything. We used to think through things. So we're very gullible now in so many ways. Now, having said that, what happened when we changed? We moved from religion, morality, knowledge, and we got away from thinking. We went in a different direction. Dr. Benjamin Russ is probably the best to answer that. He is, John Adams said he's one of the 3 most notable founding fathers. Now, we'll never study him in schools today. I try to put him in all the history standards, all the states, and reintroduce him. There's a reason John Adams said he's one of the 3 most notable. John Adams said you had George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Benjamin Rush. Now, why Benjamin Rush? Well, he signed the Declaration, he ratified the Constitution, he served in 3 different presidential administrations, he's a director of U.S. Mint, he's the founder of the abolition civil rights movement in America, started the first abolition society in America, actually led the national abolition movement. He helped found the first black denomination in America, the AME denomination. He trained the first black physicians, huge civil rights guy. He's also a huge guy in education. He's the first professor of chemistry in the United States, did the first psychiatry textbook, first chemistry textbook. He started 5 universities, 3 of them still go today. He's the first one who started formal education for women in the United States. He's also the father of American medicine. He came up with medical cures 200 years ago, we still use today. 3,000 students got their medical degree diploma signed by Dr. Benjamin Rush. In addition to that, he's very politically involved. He did the first faith-based prison reform in America, which is not surprising, because he's the guy who started the Sunday school movement in America. He's also the guy who founded the first Bible Society in America. Only 8 years later, they had 121 Bible societies going in America. How come I never heard about this guy? Because it's really hard to make him, they say the Founding Fathers, a bunch of atheists, agnostics, deists. You can't say that about them. So what we do is we omit all the Founding Fathers who don't fit the mantra of being anti-American. We hate American exceptionalism. America's not special. Anybody who'd make it look like it is special, we get rid of them out of textbooks. So Benjamin Rush, among all of his other titles, he is called the father of public schools under the Constitution. He's the guy that once we had the Constitution ratified in 1788, we had the federal government operate in 1789, he said, all right, we used to be 13 states. What type of education will it take in order for us to remain a unified nation instead of being 13 nations like we were before the Constitutional Convention? And so he came up with what we would have to teach in education, and again, it was state by state, but what we would have to teach if we're going to become a nation. And it's interesting that it was religion, morality, and knowledge. It was always the emphasis. And he's a brilliant guy, one of the best thinkers in the history of the world. And yet, look at what he said. This father of public schools under the Constitution, talking about education, he says, without religion, I believe learning does real mischief to the morals and principles of mankind. He said, if you take religion out of education, you will lose principles and you'll lose morals. Now, I've been a consultant in the U.S. Justice Department. We do the cabinet level staffs and cabinet level departments. And remember 62, 63, the court said, hey, we don't want this religion and morality stuff taught in education anymore. That's out. It's interesting that if you go to Health and Human Services, other cabinet level departments, you can see what he said about losing principles and losing morals. Without religion, learning becomes... And see, their thesis is really clear. If you teach learning, just knowledge, without rights and wrongs that come from religious teachings, then what you'll do is you will take your knowledge and you will use it to gratify whatever you want. And without rights and wrongs, that'll make you a really smart criminal, and make you a really good guy to rob Wall Street. So the ethics is all gone. And so what we see is really smart people who do really bad things because they lack the foundation that came through religion and morality. Well, you look at morality, this is teenage pregnancies for all those years prior to the court decision. This is for high school girls ages 15 through 19. Here's what happened after the removal of religion out of education. Guess what? We did lose our morals. I can show you how much it costs today. We have one federal program alone that costs $26.5 billion every year just to teach girls who are still in high school but who have a bunch of babies what they need to know in high school level. So we have a whole bunch of that. And from where I was in the Justice Department, this is single-parent moms we're talking about here. We know in the Justice Department that violent crimes committed between 1975 and 1993, 90% of them were committed by kids who were raised in single-parent homes with no mother, no father involved. We know those kids are 5 times higher, more likely to have educational problems, 4 times more likely to have emotional problems and psychological problems. We know that 3 times likelier to have health problems. I mean, what we do to kids that are the results of no morality and no religion hurts them, and it hurts the culture and society. Here's another one. This is for junior high students, ages 10 through 14. Sexually transmitted diseases like gonorrhea went right through the roof. No morals. So Common Core is not going to fix the lack of morals that we have. There's nothing in there that does that. Matter of fact, it takes us further away by excluding so much of that from history. You also have Benjamin Russ, and the piece that he did in explaining how we could be a nation, how we're going to have to be a nation through education. He said, well, he said, the number one way we do that is by teaching the Bible in schools. And he went through and gave a dozen reasons we would never take the Bible out of public schools in America. Father of public education, a dozen reasons never take it out. And this was a piece that he did on March 10, 1791. In that piece, the last thing he says is, if we ever get to the point where some generation decides they don't want to teach the Bible in schools, he said that generation will spend all of their time and money fighting crime when they could prevent crime right there in the classroom by teaching those religious principles. So you have that warning, and yet when you look at what happened, the generation that did take the Bible out of schools, yeah, they spent all their time and money fighting crime, 694% increase. Dr. Benjamin Russ also warned this. I believe there's the most knowledge in those countries where there's the most Christianity. Take religion out of education and knowledge goes down. Now, how can that be? Well, look at the SAT scores. See, we took God out of schools and SAT have dropped through the roof. Then remember he said there's the most knowledge in those countries, the most Christianity. Because we had such a drop in education, a lot of alternative education forms have come up. That's where homeschooling has exploded, parochial parochial schools have gone through the roof. There's 32,000 Christian schools, all this stuff. And so what happens, take those 32,000 Christian schools. Now this is, there are 6 nationally normed tests that are used. You know, you can have an Iowa test of basic skills, California achievement test, you can have the Stanford achievement. All these nationally normed tests, all they do is measure academic knowledge. And yet when you look at Christian schools versus public schools, Christian schools are in yellow, public schools are in red. By the time you get to the 9th grade, Christian school students have pegged out the knowledge bar on the test. By the time you get to 12th grade, public school students still haven't pegged out the knowledge bar. And you find that on average, Christian schools average 2 to 4 grade levels higher of academic knowledge. Now that would make perfect sense to me if the questions on these achievement tests were, how many books are there in the Bible? That's not a fair question for public school kids. Now what does John 3:16 say? That's not a fair question. That's not what the questions ask. The questions say, solve the following algebraic equations. The questions say, what year did the Civil War take place? And in my knowledge, it takes place the same year in a Christian school as it does in a public school. And yet the knowledge is higher in those places where they do not exclude religion across the board. So, matter of fact, you'll find that in these 32,000 Christian schools, the average SAT score is back where it was prior to 1962-63. So it's a double correlation. If you put religion back in education, scores come back up. So we have problems. Now that we've taken it out, we have a lot of problems in the opposite direction. We were, in 1962, America's #1 in the world in literacy. We have now fallen to number 65 in the world in literacy. I was at a White House briefing where they told me that in a typical year, in any typical year, we graduate 700,000 seniors from high school who are incapable of reading their own diploma. We spend $120,000 on average per student for 12 years of education. And we have nearly 1 million a year who come out functionally illiterate. They can't read above a 3rd grade level. We're not getting our money's worth in education, so let's spend more on education. That will help. We just spend more. Then, international testing. We've been doing this for a number of years. 17 out of the last 19 years, America comes in dead last in the world in international testing. We get our socks beat off by kids from Thailand and Romania and Bulgaria and Wales. All these things we think are 3rd world nations beat the dickens out of us in academics, but fortunately we have seen a recent upturn in this. One of the more recent academic international tests we had, this is the reported results. Elementary kids, our elementary kids finally scored above average when compared with other nations. Now, our junior high kids didn't do as well. They were just typical with other nations. And our senior high kids were well below average. Now, see if you get the trend here. If you've had a few years in American education, you're pretty smart. A few more years, you're not as smart. A few more years, you're not as smart. This is what caused the American School Board Journal, 16,000 public school districts in America. They, a secular group, this is what they reported seeing the international test. They said, it appears that the longer U.S. students stay in school, the less they seem to learn. Common Core is not going to fix that. Well, continue on. University of Connecticut. Go back to that philosophy of Abraham Lincoln, philosophy of schoolroom one generation, philosophy of government next. The University of Connecticut says, what will happen with the kids we're training right now? What will they believe when they get out? What kind of leaders will they make? And after doing studies, this is what they call their study, Becoming Crisis in Leadership. We're in serious trouble. Why? Because they took kids who came into the elite universities, 55 elite colleges and universities, usually listed by U.S. News and World Report. They took those kids coming in and measured them for 4 years of school. These are the universities where you're going to spend $250,000 for 4 years for your degree. Really expensive schools. They measured them when they came in, they measured them when they went out, and they found out they knew more when they came in than when they left. Their academic knowledge was higher. They reported at many of the most prestigious colleges in the United States, seniors know less than freshmen about America's history, government, foreign affairs, and economy, a phenomenon known as negative learning. You actually pay money to lose knowledge while you're in these places. So, given all of this, this is not good news. I want to take you back and finish what I'm doing by taking you back to what happened when we did that. When this was our objective of education, what product did we turn out? And let me just take you through some examples. What was the product we had when we trained students to think and trained religion, morality, knowledge? Let me take you to Fisher Ames. Fisher Ames is a framer of the Bill of Rights. He's a founding father. He specifically is the guy who gave us the House language of the First Amendment of the Constitution. You look at this founding father, distinguished founding father. By the way, he's the guy who gave us a 2-year term for House of Representatives. Used to be had elections every single year. He said 2 years is often enough. So he's an influential founding father. He passed the entrance exam and entered Harvard University when he was 12 years old. Oh, that's a little young. Well, don't get impressed with him yet. You need to know that no matter what university you went to in America back then, you had to prove yourself trilingual. You had to show that you were fluent in Latin and Greek and English. Latin because no matter where you went to school, you had to read all the classics in Latin, Plutarch, Cicero, and Homer, and Iliad. And English is obvious. Why Greek? Because at every university in America, your freshman project was they gave you a Greek copy of the New Testament. You had to translate the Greek New Testament into English. He did that when he was 12 years old. But I told you don't be impressed with him because the average age at which you went to university back then was 13 years old. On average, the average American student was trilingual by the age he was 13, could translate Greek and English. Now, you do have folks like Dr. Benjamin Russ, talk about him, father of American medicine. Here, greatest physician in American history, graduated from Princeton University when he was 14 years old. Anybody feel particularly comfortable going to a 14-year-old doctor today? Probably not. That wasn't all that unusual back then. Then you take folks like John Trumbull. John Trumbull, Justice on the Supreme Court of Connecticut, very notable guy. When he was 4 years old, he had finished reading the King James Bible through from cover to cover for the first time, 4 years old. That's not unusual. John Witherspoon signed the Declaration when he was 4 years old. That's when he finished it, and that was very typical back then. John Trumbull, when he was 6 years old, he beat this minister in a Greek contest. When he was 7.5 years old, he passed the entrance exam to Yale University. Now his parents said, that's a little young. We'll hold you out till you're 13 because that's when everybody else goes to university. So they held him out till he was 13. That's when he went to university. You also have folks like James Iredell, ratifier of the U.S. Constitution, placed in the U.S. Supreme Court with George Washington. When he was 17 years old, he was the chief financial officer in his part of North Carolina. Ran all the economics of that part of the state. 17 years old. We wouldn't think about doing that today. No way. And then you have folks like Andrew Jackson. When he was 13 years old as a soldier in the American Revolution, he was already a prisoner of war camp for fighting the Revolution at the age of 13. And then you take folks like Maria Mitchell. She's the first woman to discover a comet in the United States. Maria Mitchell, quite an astronomer. She built an observatory to teach women about science and about astronomy. And she built this telescope, and that telescope's still available today. Really fast. Look at Maria Mitchell. When she was 11 years old, she was already a teaching assistant in astronomy. When she was 12 years old, she calculated the time of a forthcoming solar eclipse. All longhand, no computers. She's going to calculate to the minute the next forthcoming solar eclipse. 12 years old, she did that. When she was 17 years old, she's running her own school in math and science. Then you have folks like the Pony Express. I told you I'm a cowboy. I love cowboy history because that's where I am. I ride horses all the time. I ride in really rough areas, and maybe that's why I love these. Look at the poster for recruiting Pony Express. It says Pony Express, St. Joe, Missouri to California in 10 days or less. Now what that means is 1,800 miles. You see the route there, 1,800 miles in 10 days on horseback. That average is 180 miles a day. If I go 40 miles a day on my horse, I've worn it out and I've worn me out. We're both at it. 180 miles a day on this, and it's interesting. Look at the rest of the poster. St. Joe, Missouri to California in 10 days or less. Wanted young, skinny, wiry fellows, not over 18. Must be expert riders, willing to risk death daily, orphans preferred. Now, notice that it said not over 18. That's where you get folks like Bronco Charlie. 11 years old, he's a Pony Express rider. Whoa, 11 years old, he's riding 180 miles a day? Yep, and he's having to fight off the outlaws and the bandits and the thunderstorms and all the stuff that goes with 10 days on an open trail, 180 miles a day. And by the way, when he was 8 years old, he's already a professional bronc buster. So if you watch rodeo on TV, those guys, they're way old. 8 years old. Then you've got folks like John Clem. John Clem was in the Civil War, particularly famous at the Battle of Chickamauga. He's from Indiana, and like most hometown newspapers, they would give you the news on their folks. So the Indiana Register from February the 10th, 1864, reported on, said John, his nickname was Little John Clem, in the Army of the Cumberland, promoted to bravery by General Rosecrans and sergeancy, has been further promoted by General Thomas to a lieutenancy and placed on his staff. So for braving the field, he got a battlefield commission, made a sergeant, and then the other general said, no, you're too important. I need you as a lieutenant on my staff. Oh, by the way, he's been 12 years old. This is Lieutenant John Clem. Now, he's wearing a sergeant's robes right there. We had high expectations. See, now we tell kids, this is what your government expects of you. If you can get through high school, if you can go get a college degree, and when you're 25 years old, if you can start paying taxes and not kill someone, you are a perfect American citizen. That's what we need out of you. You know, right now, statistically, the age of adolescence has been extended to 30 years old. That's what we teach in America. Maybe after you're 30, you can start being productive. How about high expectations? Let me close out the final part. In case you think I was just picking the cream of the crop, I want to take you back to our textbooks. This is elementary spelling book. We use this book. This is the book in which we learned to spell for 150 years. Notice it is elementary. This is the beginning spelling. This is where you started learning to spell your first words. Take a crack at some of these elementary spelling words that we had for 150 years. This is what every kid in America learned for 150 years. This is beginning spelling. This is academic rigor. Go back to this. Geography. Let's take a little geography test. Here's one. Chicago, 1862. You see down there, that's 4th grade questions on geography. You get 35 minutes on the test. Take a little 4th grade test here. All public school students do this. How many degrees of longitude are there? How many degrees right are the temperate zones? Name the principal animals, the frigid zones. What portion of the people in the globe are pagans? What portion Christians? Basic 4th grade geography test in public schools. Let's take math tests. Raise arithmetic. And remember, nobody went past 8th grade in arithmetic. So we're all looking at 8th grade problems or less here. Let's take a few 8th grade problems or less. These actually were 6th grade problems that I'm showing you here. It says, I insure 2/3 of the shop worth $3,600 and 4/5 of the house worth $6,000, paying $126. What was the rate of insurance? Anybody want to give that a shot for that 6th grade question? Take this one. How many $50 shares at 8% discount must be given for 23 bonds, $100 each, and 2% premium? That's 6th grade stuff. Every 6th grader knew the answer to that. Then let's take mental arithmetic. In mental math, you can do nothing but use your mind. You're not allowed to use paper or pencil. These are textbooks from 1877. These are, again, 8th grade and below. Let's do some mental problems. Can't calculate with any paper and pencil here. You just got to do it in your mind. A boat worth $864, of which 1/8 belonged to A, 1/4 to B, the rest to C was lost. What loss did he sustain it having been insured for $500? Solve that in your mind. Here's another one. If 6 men can do a piece of work in 5 days, in what time can they do it if they receive the assistance of 3 additional men when the work is half complete? See, we taught students to be thinkers back then. Now we just teach learning, which that's however dumb the teacher is, we're going to become that dumb as well. And that's not the way to do education. So, and don't think I'm shooting at teachers, I'm not, but that's the whole process. Proverbs 1:7 says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. When we believed that, we were a lot smarter than we are now. So Common Core, it is the problem of lipstick on a pig. It will not solve any of the educational problems we have or any of the educational problems we've had for the last 40 years. We've got to go back to fundamental things that we got wrong, and that's what it's going to take for Common Core. So we used to teach, very simply, we used to teach religion, morality, knowledge. We taught students to think, and we had high expectations. If you're interested in any of this, we've got a ton of this material outside that deals with all of this. 4 centuries of education, the Founder's Bible looks at how the Founding Fathers set up education and did it along with government and other things. So thank you guys for letting me share with you today. God bless. Thank you.